It's nice to see so many familiar faces here in the audience today. Let me begin by saying that here at the ANU, we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and we pay respect to the elders past and present. Today we have a very important and, as you can see, very popular or well-subscribed seminar by our colleague, Associate Professor Marcus Mietzner. Marcus is very well known as one of the leading scholars of Indonesian politics. He's previously written two very widely read and widely cited books, one on the Indonesian military and political Islam during Indonesia's democratic transition, and another book on Indonesian political parties, and has, of course, apart from those books, has maintained a quite formidable publishing record with numerous articles on many aspects of Indonesian politics, edited volumes and so on. So today we're fortunate to get a sort of an advanced insight into the new book he's writing, which, as you can see, is on presidential power in Indonesia. So Marcus will speak for about 45 minutes. If you have questions or comments, please hold them to the end, and then we'll have a similar amount of time dedicated to Q&A at the end. Thanks, Marcus. Take it away.
Thank you, Ed, and thanks everyone for joining. Just a few sort of special welcomes to Bill Little, for instance, who is here, who is also writing a book on Indonesian presidents. I think we will establish that our books are rather different, so we're not colliding much in this regard, but thanks a lot for being here. Also, everyone from the United States, Sydney Jones, Meredith, and others, and Ben Kirkfleet from Hawaii. Thank you all for being here, and of course, many friends from Indonesia as well. So you see here what I hope the title will be of this book. So the coalitions presidents make, presidential power and its limits in democratic Indonesia. Let me just move. Okay. So this is essentially borrowed, this title is borrowed from this quite influential book, which was written on American presidents and the way they influence policy making and the making of politics in the United States. The general theory of this book being that each American president has been an innovator who has shaped American politics in certain ways. Now, for the Indonesian case, that obviously is rather different. And what I'm trying to argue here is that Indonesian presidents largely leave their mark by how they make their coalitions, hence this title. So this is what I'm going to do today. Obviously a lot to go through. It's a pretty thick book, so I can't cover it all. I hope that whatever isn't covered for you can be raised in the Q&A. But first of all, I want to set sort of the conceptual and theoretical setting in which this book is operating, then present the main arguments of the book, then talk about presidentialism in Indonesia, what I'm talking about and what I'm not talking about. Then so the core of the book is about how presidents manage coalitional presidentialism in Indonesia, how are alliances established and maintained over time. The fifth part is then a very important one, how presidential management of coalitions has interplayed with democratic decline. The sixth part, then we need to ask, of course, why this specific form of coalitional presidentialism has taken roots in Indonesia, and then finally some comparative reflections. So first of all, the conceptual and theoretical problem that this book tries to address. So in political science, there has been for many decades now a discussion about the perils of presidentialism. this goes back to a piece Juan Linz wrote in 1994, which argued that presidentialism is a bad choice for young democracies. It's unstable. It is vulnerable to overthrows of presidents and so forth who can't manage to stay in power. And he expressed a preference then for parliamentarism. Now, there have been some people already back then in 1994 who didn't buy this argument and who reminded Juan Linz that what he was really talking about was not presidentialism as such, but the problem of presidentialism in fragmented multi-party systems, right? So Mainwaring and others reminded Juan Linz, you have to be very specific about what kind of presidentialism you mean when you talk about inherent instability. And Mainwaring said it's largely the focus, what we need to have here has to be on fragmented multi-party systems. So a question then in this debate has been, how stable is presidentialism, particularly in system where A, we have an atomized multi-partyism in place, and B, as a result of that, presidents who do not hold a majority in the legislature. And the latest answer to this question has been by this team of researchers from Oxford University, Paul Chasty, Nick Cheeseman, and Tim Power, who published in 2017 this volume. They created this concept of coalitional presidentialism, and this was the book that came out of this long research project. Now, what is coalitional presidentialism exactly about? The main argument of this school of thought is that minority presidents can achieve stability of their rule by forming post-election coalitions with parties in the legislature. And I've underlined this here because this is important. That is their focus, right? So their whole research focus is on interaction between presidents and parties in the main arena of the legislature. In order to manage these coalitions, presidents have a set of tools available to achieve this goal. So there are 5, and they call this the presidential toolkit of coalitional presidentialism. First, the legislative prerogatives of presidents. Second, partisan powers, by which they mean the control of presidents over their own parties. Then thirdly, cabinet authority, which is largely appointment powers. Then budgetary authority, and finally the exchange of favors. So the argument here is, if presidents use these strategies, these tools out of their toolkit effectively, then they can achieve remarkably stable rule, even though they only have a minority in the legislature. And in fact, so again, coming back to the concerns that Juan Linz had, coalitional presidentialism not only makes presidential systems operational, but in fact quite remarkably stable. Now, you don't have to be an expert in Indonesian politics to note that Indonesia obviously fits into that model. Both Jokowi and Yudhoyono have approached this problem of coalitional presidentialism in that way. Both came to power as minority presidents, but then built post-election coalitions with parties in the legislature. But let's have a look at how several polities that are traditionally researched by coalitional presidentialism scholars have done in terms of preserving stability. And I've mixed Indonesia into this set of countries here. And I've used 4 very broad indicators of stability of presidential systems. The first is attempted impeachment. The second, successful impeachment. The third is incumbency loss, because incumbency losses indicate problems in the governing coalition, or more broadly in the effectiveness of governance. And the fourth is post-office prosecution, because that also underlines the risk for presidents that they take when they rule in minority governments, when then often oppositions, but often also their own allies come after them after their office, their term has expired. So if you look at all these indicators, you see quite a bit is happening in a number of countries. Peru, obviously outstanding here. I think since 1985, there has been only one short-term president who has not been indicted or imprisoned after leaving office. And you also see quite a number of successful impeachments just in the last few years. You can have a look at the other countries, but of course, the attention I want to raise here is towards the case of Indonesia. We have not seen even the beginnings of an attempted impeachment, let alone a successful impeachment since 2004, which is the era that I'm looking at here. We have had no incumbency loss and no president has been prosecuted after leaving office. So even by international standards, you see that Indonesia has achieved, with its presidential system, quite a remarkable level of stability. We also, of course, need to compare that to the presidential system of Indonesia prior to 2004. So in that transitional period between 1998 and 2004, we would have had impeachments, attempted impeachments, successful impeachments. If you go through the presidents from 1998 to 2004, Suharto, of course, overthrown by a popular uprising, then Habibie forced by the MPR to resign because his accountability report was rejected. Then President Biden was impeached in 2001 and Megawati lost the elections of 2004. So quite a number of instability indicators there, but all of that changed after 2004. Again, quite unusual, not even the beginnings, the technical beginnings of a single and attempted impeachment. So by using coalitional presidentialism strategies, Indonesia's presidential system went from extreme instability, which I just outlined, to extraordinary stability, even by the international standards we just looked at. So the main question here is, how did it get there and what are the implications of this shift? So let me run through the main arguments of the book so that you know where the journey is going. So the first main argument is that post-2004 presidents have governed through a system of coalitional presidentialism that not only accommodated legislative parties, but a range of other non-party actors as well. And the implication, of course, here is that that leaves the traditional arena of the conventional coalitional presidentialism studies, which are exclusively focused on the interaction between presidents and parties in the legislature. So first main argument, we have a very peculiar form of coalitional presidentialism in Indonesia where non-party actors are situated in the same way as coalition partners of the presidents as political parties are. And this is just one indicator here of what I'm talking about. Obviously, inclusion in cabinet is a strong expression of coalitional presidentialism. Normally, again, we look at which parties get seats, but if we look behind those calculations, we actually find that a number of groups, non-party groups in Indonesia, have always been integrated into cabinet since 2004. The numbers are fluctuating, but in most cases they get represented. You see here, for instance, the military, the police, local government, the bureaucracy, oligarchs, and Muslim groups who over time see their numbers in cabinet fluctuating, but in most cases they can count on being integrated into cabinet. I should also add, of course, that a lot of these groups also find additional representation through party channels. I have this included here, for instance, for the military, divided by non-party cabinet seats and party seats, and I've done the same for the oligarchs, who sometimes make their way into cabinet through party avenues, but in other cases through non-party lines as well. And I could do the same, in fact, for Muslim groups, where of course we have NU represented through PKB, but also through non-party avenues as well. So this is just sort of an initial teaser for you to see what I'm talking about here. And I want to make that clear. For me, cabinet representation is not the only form of coalitional presidentialism. There's a whole lot more going on, a lot more demands that these groups have towards the president outside of cabinet that are also and equally important. So the second argument I want to highlight here is that the post-2004 system has enabled a complex mechanism of coalition management in which both sides balance each other pretty well. And that means for the study of Indonesia that presidents today are neither new Suhartos, nor are they puppets of cartels or oligarchies, which is what you often get in the debate about Indonesia. Jokowi now quite frequently portrayed as the new Suharto and so forth. And then on the other side of the debate, you see a lot of concepts by the oligarchy school, for instance, that presidents are essentially puppets, exchangeable puppets of party cartels or oligarchies. And I'm arguing that neither is true. And in fact, it's the balance that has marked Indonesian politics the most since 2004. So we have seen that Indonesia's presidential system has been extraordinarily stable compared to international peers and compared to its pre-2004 version. But the price for this stability has been high. It has been democratic decline. We have presidents and coalition partners who protect a labyrinth of red lines, meaning here vested interests to keep the coalition intact. And one of the main arguments of the book is indeed that it's the red lines of all of these actors on the side of the president, as well as the party and non-party actors, that really shape the coalitions that they build together. And because of these red lines that run through the coalitions, none of the areas of democratic quality that today would need repair in Indonesia have been touched. In fact, actors have reclaimed privileges lost in earlier periods of democratization. So the more conceptual conclusion then is that if you go back to Juan Linz, the problem of coalitional presidentialism and presidential systems more broadly is then no longer the question of how stability can be achieved. Remember, that was the starting point of this debate. The stability itself now has become the problem, right? So we no longer need to really think about, don't have to be so concerned with presidents about how they can achieve stability, but in fact, we need to talk about the damaging impacts of the stability that has been achieved. Now, in my work, I draw from previous works, of course, just mentioning a few here. Slater has written about cartels and promiscuous power sharing, and of course, some of that flows into my book here, but I still have some dividing lines with that approach. So presidents in my concept are not instruments of cartels, and intra-coalitional competition is actually not only very high, but it's central to the working of the alliance. Dirk Thomsa has also written some very good pieces on this issue. He's talked about strategic groups that presidents have to accommodate, but he has sort of shied away from explicitly situating these strategic groups as coalition partners of the president that are at par with parties, which is what I do in the book. And then Ed's piece, for instance, on the irony of success some time ago, which argued that the stability of Indonesian democracy was largely bought through the accommodation of potential veto powers. I'll take this argument and essentially demonstrate how that works in practice in the operation of presidential coalitions. So let me say a few words about presidentialism in Indonesia, what I'm talking about and what I'm not talking about. So my book will be about post-2004 presidentialism in Indonesia. There are several reasons for this. One being, and quite ironically, if you use the sort of strict parameters of presidentialism, presidential systems, none of the systems that were in place in Indonesia up until 2004 would actually qualify as full presidentialism. Because technically, up until 2004, the president in Indonesia was elected by a legislative body, by the MPR, and for strict presidentialism scholars, that means it's actually semi-presidentialism. But of course, the reality on the ground has been quite different. So historically, this is how I would distinguish the various phases of presidentialism in Indonesia. So we had a very, very brief period of executive presidentialism up until about from August to November 1945. Sukarno then pretty quickly handed over most of the executive power to the legislature. And so we have seen ceremonial presidentialism from 45 to about 59. Then we had, again, if you took the strict parameters, it would not be full presidentialism because the president was appointed by the MPR, but because presidents were so dominant in controlling the legislature, I would speak about autocratic presidentialism. And then we had sort of a hybrid version, transitional presidentialism from 1998 to 2004. Again, the president still elected by the MPR. And it's only really since 2004, since we had the popular election of the president, which for presidentialism scholars is really a constituting element of presidentialism. We've had that in place. And so this is what I am focusing on, full presidentialism, which then turned out to be a form of coalitional presidentialism. Now, coalitional presidentialism is all about managing powers, both sides of the equation, so presidents and their coalition partners, throwing their various powers and assets into the negotiations over the form of the coalition. On the presidential side, and I'm just going briefly through some of these main powers, of course, co-legislative powers. This is quite unique in Indonesia. Presidents have a full veto right over legislation, which is quite different from other countries. Here in Indonesia, presidents must agree from the very beginning with a piece of legislation with the parliament for the piece of legislation to become law. If the president at any stage of that process indicates disapproval, then the law cannot proceed. So this is one really major power presidents have. There's also a whole range of executive regulatory powers that presidents have that Parliament, for instance, doesn't have, right? So Parliament can make laws with the president, but it can't issue any other regulations. The president can, starting from government regulations, presidential regulations, and so forth, where the president can, outside of laws, issue a whole range of regulations. Of course, appointment powers, we've talked about cabinet, but there's a whole lot of others, whether that's in the police, in the military, in the bureaucracy, in state-owned enterprises. All of that makes the presidency incredibly important to the actors that seek to be part of the coalition. And of course, budgetary powers. A lot of the book is about how money is being used to tie actors into the coalition. That is extremely important as well. And of course, something that Chasty, Cheeseman, and Poward had also highlighted in the conventional coalition and presidentialism studies. The last three here are sort of additions, which I find are very important, but not sufficiently highlighted in the existing coalitional presidentialism literature, and that's coercive powers. So the president's control over the military and the police and law enforcement, although presidents often for the public deny that they have this power, but in practice they actually do. Extremely important to keep coalition partners in line, whether it's about pursuing or not pursuing legal cases of actors in the coalition and so forth, all of that really central. And then what I would really situate here as the key sort of political capital that a president has outside of the structural powers, and that's popularity, very simple popularity and popular legitimacy. Because if you look at, a lot of the oligarchs, a lot of the party leaders, a lot of the military leaders, police leaders, they would love to be president, but can't because they can't mobilize this level of popularity. So it's not that people like Bakri or Wiranto and so forth enjoy the fact that they needed to support somebody else as president. It was really because they couldn't. They did not get to a level of political capital that allowed them to gain the presidency themselves. So they were forced to align themselves with figures who could mobilize that popularity. So extremely important. And then finally, the high impeachment threshold that the Constitution now sets, which protects the president from impeachment procedures, which is also a major weapon now for presidents. Now, on the other side, in the book, of course, this is spelled out in much detail, and I'll do this by group, but let me just summarize some of the powers the coalition partners can bring to the table. On the side of the parties, we have the nomination powers. So the political parties made sure that presidents need to be nominated by political parties. There are no independent candidacies for the presidency as you would see in other countries. We have co-legislative and budgetary powers, especially by legislatures and local governments. We have coercive monopolies by the military and the police. We have policy implementation powers by the bureaucracy and local government. Then, of course, electoral mobilization by parties and Muslim groups. The provision of funds by oligarchs, religious legitimacy, which is provided by Muslim groups. All of these things are important for presidents to ensure effectiveness of governance, and it's an incentive to integrate the groups that provide these assets into the presidential coalition. So for all of these groups, cooperation or non-cooperation is crucial in determining effectiveness of governance. So from the perspective of presidents, often that is the threshold by which groups are integrated into the coalition or not. If the cooperation of a particular actor is needed to guarantee stability and effectiveness of governance, then often an offer is made for coalition participation. If groups are not crucial to the stability and effectiveness of governance, then they find themselves outside of the coalition parameters. So the post-2004 system has established a balance of power. So we have now seen the presidential powers and the powers from the other side by the coalition partners. So we have a balance of power in which both the president and coalition partners gain more from cooperation than confrontation, because that's the question we have to ask ourselves. Why don't we see the frequent attempts at impeachment? Why don't we see many more popular mobilizations to remove a president as we have seen in other countries? And that is because a lot of these actors have come to the conclusion that they need to cooperate with the president, and that confrontation would come at a cost that is too high. So at the end of the day, these two sort of institutional interests from both sides balance each other out. So now to the details of the management of coalitional presidentialism, and that's really the core of the book. The book is structured by actors, actually. I look at parties, I look at parliament, I look at the military, the police, bureaucracy, local government, oligarchs, and Muslim groups. In all of these chapters, I go through which powers these actors can bring to the table in order to entice presidents, to invite them into coalitions. I then balance that against the powers that the president holds over these particular groups. Then I look at how this relationship is being managed. And in each chapter, I have one case study to illustrate how this often happens in practice. But the first chapter is actually about the infrastructure that the president has at his disposal in order to manage the coalition. So you see here the setup of the presidential office, if you like, the presidential infrastructure at the moment in 2021. And so if you look here at two main actors, the State Secretariat and the Cabinet Secretariat, these are the two bodies at the moment that manage different sides of the coalitions that the president needs to draw into the alliance. The State Secretariat, currently it's Pranowo Anung who is in there. He is taking, this is Pratikno, the State Secretariat. He is taking care of the non-party arrangements of the coalition. So he often would approach those partners of the coalition that are not political parties. The Cabinet Secretaries, this is Pranowo Anung, who is a party official from PDIP. He is often in charge to lead the negotiations with political parties over coalition arrangements. If you look below the level of the State Secretariat, very important here is the Military Secretariat, because that's the official channel of the president to deal with the military and importantly with the police as well, because the police is under the military secretariat. You could, of course, expand this graph quite a bit. You have Pas Pampres, which is also an informal line for the president to deal with the military. You have the adjutants, which are below the military secretariat, which are also providing additional lines of communication, both ways, in fact, with the police and the military. Then, since Jokowi's first term, we had the office of the president's staff and the 5 deputies. That office keeps changing in its function. It was set up by Luhut Panjaitan as a way of managing the coalition as well, but it has morphed since then into various forms of think tanks. And under Muldoko, Muldoko is trying to re-establish the power it had under Luhut, but obviously he's struggling a bit with his own personal issues at the moment. So the two key institutions here, the State Secretariat and the Cabinet Secretariat, and the same was true for Yudhoyono, in fact, where the two holders of that position were the key negotiators for the president with coalition partners. For the parties, and it's very important for me, I'll come to that in a second, to distinguish between parties and the legislature. Sort of the conventional coalitional presidentialism literature would often deal with them in a package, right? So if presidents form coalitions with parties, that would then almost automatically secure their majority in the parliament. I argued that is not the case in Indonesia, so I separate the two conceptually. So the parties, it's very interesting and important to talk about their weaknesses first. You know, it's quite astonishing that since 2004, no conventional party cadre has been competitive for the presidency, right? So Megawati was the last chairman of an established political party who was competitive in a presidential race. Since then, we have seen outsiders, and by outsiders, I mean outsiders from the established party system, who typically establish personalist vehicles to facilitate their nomination. That was the case with Yudhoyono, and it's the case with Prabowo as well. So established parties, they are really dependent on the popularity of outsiders to gain access to the powers associated with the presidency. You see these days in Indonesia, again, everybody wants to be president. Muhaimin wants to be president. Erlangga wants to be president. Puan wants to be president, but they all have a problem, and that is the lack of popularity. So at the end of the day, they have to align with somebody that can mobilize the popularity that they lack. So presidents then keep parties in the coalition partly through the distribution of cabinet seats, and it's quite interesting to look at how this is done. There's quite a bit of literature that sort of focuses on the inclusiveness of Indonesian coalitions, but there's actually a quite sophisticated key in distributing cabinet seats. You see this here. So this looks at the second Jokowi government in 2019. And you do see that presidents make quite important distinctions between parties that nominated them or did not nominate them, and parties that came early to the coalition or came late to the coalition. So you see, for instance, here with smaller parties like PKB or Nasdem, who hold 10% of the DPR seats, but have almost double the percentage of cabinet seats. So that means it does pay off to come early in presidential nominations. It's not the same. PAN, for instance, of course, as we all know, was not part of this coalition, this nominating coalition in 2019. It will likely be invited now back into cabinet, but based on this sort of statistics here, it probably will get one seat, right? And not more than that. So the message coming from this statistics here, and it's quite consistent over time, is that nominating parties get rewarded disproportionately. Those parties who were not part of the nominating coalition but then joined later are getting punished. And then there are, of course, the very few who don't join at all and they don't get anything at all. Then, of course, we do have the rare occasions in which parties do get together to coerce the president into a particular nomination or into a particular policy. Here's the picture from 2018, where Jokowi failed to get his vice presidential nomination through, where the parties aligned against him and forced Maruf Amin on him. So on the one hand, presidents have this tool available to them to distribute cabinet seats, and parties are happily receiving that, but there are rare occasions where parties form alliances against the president, and then parties can be extremely powerful in that coalition. As I mentioned, I situate the parliament as a separate actor from parties. I do not think that there's a direct linkage between the party's position in presidential coalition and the legislature. So we need to look at how presidents form distinct coalitions with legislators. And the way this is done, I can't go into details here, but the whole chapter is about this. It's essentially a system of brokerage in the parliament by which presidents form alliances with the senior leadership of the parliament in order to achieve consent towards their policies, laws, and especially budgets. It's quite remarkable that since 2004, we have not seen, for instance, a single budget in which there wasn't a consensus decision by Parliament. So no walkouts, no voting against budgets. We have seen some votes on fuel subsidies, which were related to sort of supplementary budgets, but the budget itself the goal of presidents is that every one of the legislators needs to agree, and they almost always do. Right? And the way to achieve this is that every single legislator personally needs to be bought off through a system of patronage. And so this is where throughout this long process of budgeting in the parliament, each single member of parliament gets something out of it, some project that is being channeled back to their constituencies and so forth. And the way this works is that the speaker is the chief broker in this regard. You see here the consultative agency and the caucuses are part of the system as well. The brokers below the speakers are the deputy speakers and then the chairpersons of the various committees. So this is the flow of the brokerage, if you like, and it's not necessarily through the political parties with whom the president forms separate coalition arrangements. And my case study in this chapter is, of course, devoted to this gentleman because he was the chief broker of the DPR who has done it most effectively and has done it most bluntly. And so it was possible for me to reconstruct how this works from his own statements in court and so forth, because eventually, of course, he did go to court, and it's very insightful to look at his testimonies to see how Parliament works. And Jokowi liked Sergio Novanto because of his brokerage skills, right? There was always this sort of mystery why Jokowi was so fond of Sergio Novanto that he not only approved him returning to the chair of the DPR, but also made him chairperson of Golkar. And that's because no other person was as effective in this brokerage role as Sergio Novanto. So the president would go to him, I want this law passed, I want that budget passed, you make it happen. And Sergio Novanto would do the deals that were necessary to achieve that. Not all of them illegal, of course. A lot of what's happening here is so pork barreling, trading of projects for certain parliamentarians and so forth, but on the side, and this is what he then went to prison for, a lot of money was flowing as well into the private pockets of Sergio Novanto and his sub-brokers. One of
Marcus, just a notice that we're coming up to time. You should try and finish within 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, okay. So let me just say a few words about how these coalitions are managed. I won't be able to go into all of the details with each actor, but intra-actor competition is an organizing principle of coalition management. So presidents not only tolerate competition between their coalition partners, they in fact profit from it. So here's one example very briefly where you see three gentlemen here. So on the very left, Gatot, the then head of the armed forces, in the middle, Tito, the head of the police, and on the right, Budi Gunawan, who was initially, when Jokowi came to power, nominated as police chief. Now, this was the first crisis of the Jokowi presidency when he came under pressure from the police because Jokowi wanted to withdraw the nomination of Budi Gunawan as police chief. And so the police was openly rebelling against this decision. What did Jokowi do? He turned to the military for support in order to counterbalance the influence of the police. So this is the way through which Gatot Nuryanto then came into the office of TNI commander. In fact, through the normal procedures, the army would have not been up for the TNI headship at the time, but the army was arguing to Jokowi, you need us now, and he followed that advice. So Gatot was put into that position. Once Gatot allowed Jokowi to counterbalance the police, Tito was put in charge of the police, was able to clean the ranks of the Budi Gunawan networks. So the police became a loyal Jokowi supporter, at which point Gatot turned against the president and became sort of a bit of an opponent within the coalition, which then led to a constellation in which Jokowi used Tito as the new power center of the police to counterbalance the military. So intra-group competition actually helps the president to keep the coalition in balance. Very important in the management of the coalition, especially the non-party actors, are the interest groups. Yeah? So we have Corpri and BKN for the bureaucracy, APSI, APKESI, APKASI for local government, Kadin and HIPMI for the oligarchs, and UN Muhammadiyah for the Muslim groups. So a lot of these negotiations that are occurring between presidents and these groups are occurring through these interest groups. Here is one of these meetings, which was particularly interesting very early on in the Jokowi presidency, a meeting of Jokowi with governors. And the head of the delegation at the time was the governor of South Sulawesi, who then said, seandainya kami bisa berandai-andai, ini adalah partai presiden terbesar. So if we can discuss here, we are the president's biggest party. The governors are the leaders of your party in the regions. Bahwa gubernur adalah pemimpin partai di daerah. And at this occasion, they asked for 1 trillion rupiah each for their provinces. Jokowi nodded. There were some deals done. And of course, that governor of South Sulawesi later ended up in cabinet in his second term. Official events, which we often look at as some sort of boring ceremonial occasions, are actually crucial for the management of coalitions. There are important events of political theater. They provide the platform in which the president can express expectations towards the coalition partners, and on the other side, for these coalition partners to express their demands and frustrations. So I went through quite a lot of these speeches given at these occasions, and they include very important demands and often lead to a recalibration of the relationship between the president and coalition partners. Here's Jokowi, for instance, one of these events, a corporate event to keep the bureaucracy in line. Now, the composition of these presidential coalitions has been relatively stable over time. Important actors are included, not so important actors are excluded. That includes the liberal groups, of course, over a long period of time, but there's been one important difference between the Jokowi and Yudhoyono governments. Yudhoyono included the militant Islamic groups into the broader parameter of coalitional presidentialism, while Jokowi excluded them and ultimately repressed them. But even there, Jokowi recalibrated his coalition by including more of the mainstream Muslim conservatives like Maruf Amin. Briefly, to democratic decline, this is all pretty obvious. Here you see how democracy slowly but steadily declined after a peak of at about 2008. And this has, as I argue in the book, a clear relationship to coalitional presidentialism, because coalitional presidentialism, by establishing these red lines of all of the actors that are not being touched, both on the side of the president and the coalition partners, it weakens horizontal and vertical accountability. Key areas of reform are effectively turned into taboo zones, and conservative values of coalition partners like the military or the Muslim groups are upgraded to state values. For me, the tipping point in this process in which coalitional presidentialism turned from an asset of providing stability into one of a liability in the form of stagnation and regression was 2009 with Yudhoyono's re-election. Up until this point, coalitional presidentialism was still sort of experimented with. As you remember, Yudhoyono came in a pretty weak position. then formed his very large coalition, made it work, and his re-election with a landslide victory sort of confirmed for a lot of political actors that that was a winning model of political organization. And after that, Jokowi, after initially in 2014 challenging this approach, he simply adopted it for his presidency as well. Briefly, why do we see this form of coalitional presidentialism in Indonesia? I think there are three sort of large areas we need to look at. First is institutional. I think the 2002 constitutional amendments were critical in producing coalitional presidentialism because it did something that very few constitutional amendment processes can do, and that is increasing the powers of many actors at the same time. So in this case, both the president gained more powers through the popular mandate gained from a direct election and the protection from impeachment. It's now near impossible for an Indonesian president to be impeached. It's possible, but there are extremely high hurdles. But at the same time, the DPR and other actors also gain power. So that's the first and very important one. The second factor, I think, is experiential. Ed and I interviewed Yudhoyono in 2004, and it was really 2014, and it was really astonishing how often he came back to his experience as a minister under Wahid. Right? He said, I see what happens to presidents that do not want to cooperate with their coalition partners. I see what happens if they believe they're safe and then they fall nevertheless. And this whole idea of the presidency was, I need to prevent chaos, and the more people I integrate into my coalition, the less chaos I have. Again, Jokowi in 2014 said, I'm going to change all of that, but it took several weeks only for him to change his mind and to reverse back to the winning model of coalitional presidentialism that he had seen under Yudhoyono. Then this last factor is ideational. I mean, it's a factor that's easily dismissed as purely rhetorical, but you do hear it quite a lot if you talk to Indonesian politicians. Why these big coalitions? Why so much cooperation? They would often refer to these traditional values of cooperation, gotong royong and musyawarah mufakat and so forth, in order to defend that approach. You know, any speech by Megawati, for instance, would give you some sense of that. And really, finally, the comparative contextualization. So we have seen from the beginning that post-2004, Indonesia is an example of coalitional presidentialism that sits at the very high end of both the stability and inclusiveness scale. And it shows that coalitional presidentialism sort of need to shift their focus a little to include the non-party and non-legislative arenas as well. So that's the main focus of the book. There's a lot happening in coalitional presidentialism that's not related to parties and legislatures, right? So that's how I understand the contribution to the broader debate on coalitional presidentialism. I believe that there's a very productive way to integrate studies of civil-military relations, bureaucracy studies, and other variants to be integrated into coalitional presidentialism studies. And I'll also mention at the beginning, you know, for me, the really big point to take away here is that the danger of coalitional presidentialism or presidential systems overall is no longer the issue of vulnerability, instability, the inability of presidents to rule effectively. It's the perils of stability that we now need to talk about. Very finally, absolutely last point, there is, of course, always the question from comparativists who would say, well, how representative is Indonesia really for coalitional presidentialism that includes so many non-party actors? So I've done sort of a little bit of comparison in this regard. And it turns out that actually what happens in Indonesia isn't all that unusual in other countries as well. So if you look at the last column here, So the percentage of cabinet seats held by non-party actors is actually quite high in most of the presidential systems I looked at, right? So Indonesia, it's 55%, Kenya 57%, Peru 53%, Brazil 61%. Brazil, this is a number, of course, only under Bolsonaro. It would have been much lower prior to him coming to power. But I think the bottom line here is Indonesia is, as I said, at the high end of stability and inclusiveness, but it's in no way unusual, and it doesn't exclude the possibility for us to compare Indonesia productively to other countries as well. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Marcus, for a fascinating presentation. Now, just a couple of announcements on how we're going to do this. We've got almost 130 people online, so I expect there'll be a lot of questions. And some people have already expressed written questions into the chat, so we'll try and go through those. But you can also indicate if you would like to ask a question just by using the raising hands function in Zoom. And I apologize if we don't manage to get through to everyone, but I will try to, obviously I would ask people to try and keep their questions as succinct as possible. You'll also note that we're recording this discussion. We won't be putting this we normally don't put this Q&A session online. It's just for the benefit of the presenter to go back on later. But nevertheless, if you would prefer not to be recorded, please just indicate that and we will pause the recording. I'd also like to take this opportunity just to announce that next week we have another seminar at the same time, next Tuesday, still focusing on presidents, but jumping over one country, looking at Duterte and public opinion polling in the Philippines. Stephen Rood is making that presentation. All right, so let's go to the first question in chat. I'll try and alternate. So this first question, I'll read it just to get us going, is from Darendra Wardana. Marcus, I'm sure you can see that there. So he's particularly interested, I think it's, yes, Darendra is especially interested in this question about the others group in these lists of cabinet compositions that you list. You know, people like millennials, business people, startups, and so on. Can you tell us a bit more about them and their composition and their relative strength compared to other groups?
Yeah, so these are essentially the groups that are almost permanently excluded, right? So I think I made it clear that presidents make their choices about who is included and who is excluded based on the importance for them. So they might have, we talked about millennials, and there would be NGOs and the liberals and so forth. They're all at the margins of the political system, electorally not all that important. They don't have the power to seriously threaten the stability of government, and therefore they're not integrated in the same way. So that would be my very brief answer. And it sort of explains as well why Jokowi has paid no attention to the liberal margins of the political system that were so important in bringing him to power in 2014. At least they believed they were so important, but you know, they weren't important anymore to run government itself.
Thanks, Marcus. But I think the question was partly asking about that column you had in your first table of people in cabinet who were listed as other without being specified.
Oh, all right. Okay.
Yeah.
So sorry, I thought it was a more general question. Okay, so the others, there you have technocrats, for instance, right? So the Sri Mulyanis and so forth, who are brought in for their expertise. Right? So they have no power base, they have no pressure really that they could bring to the table to coerce the president into a coalition arrangement. They are simply experts that the president brings in order to run various departments that he doesn't want to give to one of the coalition partners, right? And the finance ministry would be one of these examples, right? Where a neutral, essentially powerless person is put into this position. So that's what we have in this category of the others.
Thank you. Paul Hutchcroft was next on my list.
Yes, excellent talk. Marcus. Really top-notch, and clearly a fantastic book is on the way. I have just two quick questions. First of all, the system you describe has endured for 17 years, but still it only two presidents, both of whom, as you pointed out, are very popular as well as outsiders. So how enduring do you think the system might be if a future president is unable to match the kind of sustained popularity that have been evident under Yudhoyono and Jokowi, especially given the extent to which you give a lot of analytical weight to popularity? The second question, closely related to that, is what do you see as prospects for reform? What might disrupt this system of coalitional presidentialism? And what specific reform measures would you see as most promising of improving the quality of democracy and overcoming this thing you call the perils of stability? So particularly going back to your mention in one of the final slides about the 2002 constitutional amendments, if you were working with a group of reform advocates on this, what would you see as the most important to focus upon? Great, thank you.
Yeah, in terms of the sustainability of this system, I think you really would have to have somebody who, and this sort of combines with your second question, you would have to have somebody who is truly determined to stand outside of this system, right? And Jokowi pretended to be somebody like this in 2014. This entire campaign was directed against coalitional presidentialism. He said, I will not be held hostage by all of these coalition partners and so forth. I don't care if I only have a minority in parliament. I think it's possible for me to rule in this way. But at the first occasion of being challenged, and that was in fact over the cabinet announcement, where Megawati threatened to withdraw support if a certain minister was appointed, he immediately reverted back to what he found was was Yudhoyono's winning formula. So that would have to change, you know, that somebody comes in and finds there's more to gain from challenging this system than from cooperating with it. But it's very tempting, and this is, you know, coming to the first question as well. You were talking about the popularity. The popularity, I would argue, of these two presidents is also not necessarily coincidental, right? So with Jokowi in particular, we have seen, especially in the second period, this increasing dominance of his allies over the media. Yeah, so, you know, almost every one of these media oligarchs are now sitting in one capacity or another in government. They decide what the population gets to hear in terms of, for instance, the COVID response, which was not stellar, but still Jokowi gets 70% approval rating out of that. So we are now in a situation where this coalitional presidentialism as such produces an environment in which presidents can control the political system, and that includes the popularity question as well. And that's why I included the re-election issue as an indicator of stability, right? Because I think this is not happening in a vacuum. So if a president controls the coalition, controls the media, controls much of the political system, re-election is, of course, much easier. So in terms of the reform, again, you would have to have somebody coming in, an ad hoc figure, right? So who, and he did exactly, you know, ad hoc's criticism towards Jokowi has always been that, you know, he was not prepared to go the full way. That in terms of the rhetoric, he would be challenging the elite, but he wasn't prepared to take up the fight. Ahok did take up the fight. Ahok ended up out of office and in prison, and Jokowi ended up in the second term. So the temptation is very high to just keep going with the system that we have.
Thank you. So the next question in chat, I'll read it out to save time. It's from Alex Arifianto from RSIS in Singapore. Thanks, Alex. The first question is about differences and continuities with the pattern of the 1950s when rainbow coalitions were already visible. So how different is the contemporary pattern to what we find back in the 1950s? And the second question is a more technical one about how do you operationalize the concept of oligarchs in your study? Is it based on wealth and so on? Yeah.
So 1950s obviously was a parliamentary system, right? So the majority in parliament decided who was prime minister and who wasn't, and we saw a prime minister falling about every year. So this was a crucial difference to, I mean, apart from the difference between parliamentarism and presidentialism, but the crucial difference was that it was so much easier to remove a prime minister than it was to remove a president today. And the protections built into the post-2002 constitutional amendments around the presidency, you have to go through the hurdles that are built towards an impeachment are a crucial factor in creating coalitional presidentialism. I think that a lot of the parties, the reason we have not seen even an attempt at impeachment is that parties realize it's pointless, right? They would have to jump over such a high threshold to move against the president that they don't do it, right? So, and if there's no sort of profit to be gained from impeachment proceedings, so they better cooperate. Right, so this is a major driver, and that wasn't present, and it wasn't present before 2004 either. Right, so the whole issue that led to the wide impeachment actually led to the 2002 amendments that then protected the president more strongly and created a system in which the president is much stronger than before. In terms of the oligarchs, my definition of an oligarch is a political operator whose primary political capital is direct control of wealth. That's my definition, right? So that differs somewhat from Winters, and in fact, Vediadis and Robeson, they don't define oligarchs at all. They define oligarchy as a system, right? So my definition of oligarch focuses on availability of personal wealth as the primary capital of a political actor.
Thanks. The next question is from Ben Kirkfleet. It's in chat, but I see Ben is primed and ready to go. So Ben, do you want to ask your question in person?
I just wanted to know if you'd run this kind of argument by the politicians who've been in the thick of it and see what their claim, what you say, does it resonate with their experiences and their perceptions?
Well, actually, it's based on what these politicians have told me, right? So I didn't say much about the sources of this book, but it's basically the insiders of the system on which I based this account. And in fact, I mentioned this at the very end of the presentation. Their sort of justification would be ideational, right? So we are a society that traditionally favors cooperation over confrontation that goes back to gotong royong, musyawarah mufakat, and so forth. And Megawati would still give a lot of speeches today about how she finds this idea in democracy that a majority of 50+1 should rule over the rest totally outrageous. She said we shouldn't have votes. You know, we are a society that was born out of these principles of cooperation and so forth. Of course, in my view, in this way, I'm sort of a political economist, I think this is sort of the decoration for quite logical dynamics of coalitional presidentialism in which both partners gain a lot in the distribution of resources, right? But it's smartly defended in an ideational way.
Thanks, Marcus. Sydney Jones, you were next with a question or a comment perhaps on the police. Oh, you're muted, Sydney.
You're muted, Sydney.
Got it, yeah. No, it was just a quick comment on the on the issue of the police in the in terms of the competition among actors, because it seems to me that while we're all concerned about the increasing role of both the police and the military as part of the democratic decline, in fact, the police role seems to have been effectively diminished both by Budi Gunawan maintaining a very strong presence and control over factions within the police, but also by Jokowi managing to put in this loyalist as the Kapolri without any basis of support, as far as I can tell, within the police as an institution more generally.
Yeah, so I think that's a general problem with the way presidents have tried to integrate the police and the military into their coalitions. And it's very similar between Yudhoyono and Jokowi, in fact, and this is where I mentioned at the beginning the role of adjutants, for instance, especially at the very beginning of a presidential term. Presidents have military and police adjutants that they then send off back into the force. They become some middle range officers, and at the end of a president's second term, they become senior leaders of the police, right? So these loyalists, whether it's the adjutants, whether it's pas pampres, whether it's other forms of proximity between presidents and these officers, is a major tool of integrating security agencies into the coalition. But the implication is exactly what you mentioned, that of course there are parts, and one could argue the majority of these officers who are not integrated through that mechanism, right? So what is integrated is the elite, right? So Jokowi then, Yudhoyono as well, then has the ability to appoint loyalists to leadership positions, while the majority of the lower ranks might actually not be in support of the president. And in fact, this is an argument that presidents have used to argue that they do not manipulate these organizations. Muldoko, for instance, has always said, what are you talking about, us putting loyalists into these key positions? Surveys have shown that the majority of military officers have voted for Prabowo, which they then take as evidence that their influence is not autocratic, right? But I think and this is where generally a lot of the coalition building for the other actors as well, you could make the same arguments for NU and other organizations where the coalition building happens at the elite level. Right? It doesn't mean that the entire organizations are then drawn into the coalition as well.
Thank you. The next question was from Dedi Dinarto. It's in chat, but Dedi, are you with us? Do you want to ask that question directly?
Sure, Ed. Thanks. Excellent presentation, Marcus. Just one quick questions on the potential enactment of the pokok-pokok haluan negara. Something quite similar like the previous garis-garis besar haluan negara that was proposed by the Bambang Susatyo as the chair of MPR. So one of the idea is to shift the budgetary power from president to the parliament. So at this point, how significant do you think this would affect the future president's ability to accommodate the interests of oligarchs? Because one point that you mentioned in your presentation is that on budgetary power, president has the ability to sort of like facilitate oligarch in this regard. So that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, so first of all, this wasn't Bambang Susatyo's idea, this was Megawati's idea, and she has been talking about this for quite some time. This was a thing that her father had been very strong about, and it then made its way through Megawati into the MPR. Interestingly, Jokowi, when he first heard about it, was flat out opposed to this idea because he thought that this would limit the flexibility of presidents to respond to short-term policy challenges, and he has since then changed his mind, right? And this in itself says something about how coalitional presidentialism works. You know, he has made compromises, and he seems now to be in support of it. Generally, the way I've seen this formulated, I don't think it actually will have much to it. What you mention as a limitation on the budgetary powers is actually a paragraph that would say that the parliament could reject presidential budgets if they thought they were not in line with these policy guidelines. But they can do this now already, right? So they can, every single time a budget is getting to the DPR, they can say no, but they never do. Because in the process of negotiating it, everyone gets something. So what this new guideline would do would just be to give the DPR even a little bit more leverage to ask for more, to say yes to the budget. That's it, I think. I don't think it would have a great policy implication for the future.
Thanks. The next question is from Nava Nurania. She has, yes, it's not the question in chat, but an updated question. Thanks, Nava.
Hi, thanks, Ed. And thanks, Marcus, for the presentation. I know you've said a few words about it at the beginning of the Q&A, but if you could expand more on the, what are the limits of the coalitional presidentialism, either in Indonesia or in the literature as a whole, and like what are the patterns of inclusion and things like that? Thanks.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot in flux, and as I looked at the comparison, Brazil, for instance, is a very interesting case where prior to Bolsonaro, we actually had pretty stable party government there. So the Workers' Party was in power, and cabinet seats would be largely distributed to party members and so forth. But Bolsonaro has completely scrambled this entire system. So he now completely bypasses the parties in parliament, and he's governing, he's patching together majorities based on individual alliances with parliamentarians. It's similar, not the same, but similar to the Philippines, where parties are extremely weak and presidents sort of do their deals as well with individual parliamentarians. So as populists become stronger over time, they have an impact as well on presidentialism. And it becomes more difficult, in fact, to see the outlines of what would have been the conventional coalitional presidentialism. And this is my criticism towards that school, that it only focuses on that area of parties and legislative interactions. And I think with populists challenging these conventional structures, we need to look more and more at what's happening outside of that. You've seen in my last table, there's 2 countries where I don't have the numbers yet. It's Ukraine and Bolivia, where also this sort of conventional pattern of negotiations between presidents and parties also seems to be breaking down. So my prediction would be that in the future, we're looking more and more at these sort of particularistic negotiations between presidents and actors that are important to their rule, rather than simply looking at which party supports the president and which one doesn't.
So this leads to the next couple of questions, which are both about extending your model to other places. So Tony Reed, and I'll just refer to the question, asks, where else would this model work? And in particular, why is India resistant to coalitionism? And Leela Sari, who can't ask the question because she's in her car, asks about whether you could extend this framework to the subnational level in Indonesia. Does this work for governors, mayors, bupati, and so on?
Yeah, so first on India, obviously, we have a different system, right? So parliamentary system versus presidentialism. So this is why India doesn't feature in a lot of these studies simply on on presidentialism. Personally, I think if India had a presidential system and Modi would have found a way around that, it would work in a very similar way. But institutionally, as comparativists, we need to stay away from comparing apples and oranges. And in this case, it would tell us not to go into the game of comparing coalitional presidentialism to the parliamentarism of India. The second question about a subnational level, I think there are significant differences to the presidency. Number one being the issue of impeachment and so forth is very different at the local level. Governors, Bhupatis do not have, or should not have at least, control over the police and the military. These are all national institutions, but there are elements of that, right? So the biggest element I would say here where these two levels meet is the control of the bureaucracy, right? So I think the local government leaders make similar deals with the bureaucracy that presidents make in order to keep the bureaucracy as part of their coalitions. But yeah, so I think it's a very intriguing idea to extend that, but you know, there are significant exceptions to that extension.
Let me now go to Colin Barlow, who's been waiting very patiently. Thank you, Colin.
Yeah, thanks very much, Marcus, for an excellent talk. My question relates to the relationship between stability and regional aspects, regional progress. Indonesia, of course, is a very, very large country. The presidency is focused in Jakarta. I happen to have worked in Nusa Tenggara Timor for 30 years. I've experienced both the Suharto regime and the current circumstances. To me, since 2004, there's been a gigantic release of energy through NGOs and other instrumentalities, which has been very important for development. Jakarta doesn't seem to have an enormous influence on these remote situations. Could you comment on that?
Well, I don't know how to comment on it other than saying that's part of the decentralization process since 2001. And so I deal in the book with parts of that in the chapter on local governments, right? And so the way presidents have tried to build local governments into their coalitions, both through the party avenue and through the non-party avenue. I mean, Yudhoyono, for instance, had for the very first time as his Minister of the Interior a governor who was a non-party representative. And now, of course, we have people like Risma in government as well. So this is part of trying to secure the loyalty of local government representatives towards the president in Jakarta. And we've seen this in the 2019 election when Jokowi's team went around Indonesia and got signatures from, I think, 350 Bupatis to support his re-election. And the leverage here was often, well, you sign this paper and we make sure you get good allocations for your next budget and so forth. So this is what the presidents are concerned about primarily. You know, how do local government leaders feature in the defense of their political power in Jakarta? I think that's number one. Number two would be, how do these areas relate to major infrastructure projects that presidents want to get through? And then maybe number 10, number 11 would be the issue that you mentioned about NGOs on the ground and sort of micro development issues. So again, I would say this is not something that is on a president's mind every day. It's about political loyalty and it's about macro effectiveness of the government apparatus.
Thanks. I'm going to, well, actually in a moment, I want to throw to Bill Little to see he's also writing a book on the topic, to give him an opportunity to give some brief comments. We are running out of time, unfortunately. We probably won't get through all the excellent questions. But first, I want to bundle together the next couple of questions. One from Hao Hill. Hao is asking about what the implications of your analysis are for the formulation of high quality development policy, including in terms of socio-economic progress, environmental protection and such like. And Bayu Kurniadi asks a similar question. What's the effect of this model on effective governance? In particular, Jokowi often complains about his role of the chief of government being constrained by laws, regulations, and various other limits on his power.
Right. So again, it's this payoff between stability and policy reform, if you like. So in terms of the stability that each government needs in order to implement policies effectively, that stability is there, right? And that's what presidents have in mind if they essentially keep key actors from sabotaging their policies because they're part of the broader presidential coalition. So that part of it works, but the part that doesn't work is to come to policies that are not simply reflections of vested interests of the partners that are included in the coalition. And I'm sure, Hal, you would disagree with me on that, but I think the omnibus bill was a very good example for that, where a lot of the oligarchs were in fact sitting on the committee of the drafting of this bill. The labor unions were conveniently marginalized during the pandemic, social mobility restrictions, and so forth. So if you look at the main outcomes of this omnibus bill, you will find the key interests of entrepreneurs and oligarchs more broadly. I think that is a problem. Others might disagree with that, but generally the main problem is wherever you look, you see segmental policies being made, and it's the same is true for the Muslim organizations, right? So a lot of you look at the Undang-Undang Pesantren that was recently passed. I mean, it would have been unthinkable in the past to have such a law in the first place, but now NU is in the government, and so they got this law as a present. So everyone gets something out of it that maintains stability. But in terms of policy, a lot of people are happy, but as a sort of neutral policy producing process, there are significant flaws.
Bill, I wanted to give you a chance to make some brief, we are almost out of time, so they'll necessarily have to be very brief. And you're still on mute.
Bill, you're on mute.
All right, I'm back, right? Okay, as everybody, I've really been fascinated by the presentation. This is, to me, this is totally new. Marcus hasn't shared this with me before, and I haven't shared much of my presidential work with him before either. Maybe we're sort of warily circling each other to see what is likely to come out of these two projects. But I am delighted to be asked, as you know, in the event, I am really delighted to be asked to participate in this because I now see in its broadest outlines what Marcus is trying to do, and I think. At first look, it certainly appears, A, that there's going to be a major contribution to the comparative presidential literature. I also read Skarnik back in the day and used it as a model once as a starting point and so forth. And Marcus really has made very good use of that literature in terms of making an argument about how Indonesia is the same and different and so forth. So at that conceptual level, it's really going to make a contribution. Secondly, in terms of evidence and concepts that enable us to look at evidence on the ground, like who are the actors? Who are the actors on the presidential side? Who are the actors on the other side? Not just parties, but really importantly, non-parties. And all of that looks like it's really laid out clearly, and a lot of evidence provided by Marcus, who has now spent so much time in Indonesia interviewing all these people that this is going to be a very rich book. So I'm really looking forward to seeing it and using it as a resource for my own work.
Thank you, Bill. So that looks like a very solid vote of confidence in Marcus's ongoing book. So look, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time. So I'm really sorry to the people who were next in the queue, well, everyone else who was next in the queue. I think it was Meredith and Bramantia Basuki in particular. So let's call this formal part of the event to a close. Hang on, Marcus, go ahead.
Well, so like last week, I mean, I'm happy to stay.
I was just going to suggest that, yeah. So for those of you who don't have to rush off and teach or go to bed, for those of you who are in the middle of the night, please just hang on here and we can just continue the conversation informally, and perhaps Marcus will be able to address some of those questions we haven't been able to deal with so far. But for those of you who do have other things to attend to, thanks very much for coming. We do have this seminar next week on Duterte for you to remember and hopefully attend. And thank you very much, Marcus, for a fantastic presentation, and all the best for your new book.